The dust in the Historical Society's archives wasn't merely a nuisance. It was a constant, tangible presence. A fine, gray powder clinging to everything. A physical manifestation of time itself. I'd grown accustomed to its taste, a faint metallic tang on my tongue, and the way it made the air heavy. Still, my office, a cramped alcove carved out of the main reading room, smelled perpetually of aged paper and forgotten dreams. It was here, amidst the silent weight of centuries, that I found my solace, my purpose. Others might call it mundane, this meticulous cataloging of ephemera, but to me, each faded letter, each brittle ledger, was a whispered secret waiting to be properly heard. Today, my project was a recent acquisition, a collection donated by the estate of a long-defunct local family. It was mostly banality, receipts for dry goods, faded photographs of stern-faced ancestors, a few uninspired sermons. I worked through it methodically, a pair of white cotton gloves protecting the delicate paper, my breath held shallow to avoid disturbing the fragile fibers. Each item was logged, described, and placed in an acid-free folder. It was a slow, deliberate process, the kind that demanded absolute focus but offered little in the way of excitement. Until, that is, I reached the very bottom of a sturdy wooden crate, beneath a stack of particularly dull tax records from the 1870s. There, tucked away as if purposefully concealed, was a small, unbound sheaf of papers. No ribbon, no protective cover, just a loose bundle. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth, often rough texture of old parchment, registered something different immediately. The paper felt unusually thick, almost pulpy, and strangely cool to the touch, despite the stuffy warmth of the archive. My brow furrowed. This wasn't standard stationery for the era. I carefully picked up the first sheet. The handwriting was cramped, almost frantic, the ink a faded sepia. But it wasn't the script that arrested me. It was the content. Not a letter, not a diary entry, but a series of disjointed observations, punctuated by what looked like crudely drawn symbols, circles within squares, jagged lines that didn't resolve into any recognizable letter. The language was archaic, even for the 1800s, laced with peculiar turns of phrase and obscure references. The moon bleeds upon the stone. The silent watchers gather. Their hunger grows in the deep earth. My initial reaction was academic curiosity. A local eccentric, perhaps? Someone dabbling in spiritualism, a common enough pastime in the Victorian age. But as I turned to the next page, a faint tremor ran through me. This wasn't merely odd. It felt wrong. The air in my small office, usually so still, seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. I instinctively glanced over my shoulder, though I knew I was alone in this wing of the building. The subsequent pages continued in the same vein. Fragments of what seemed to be ritualistic instructions, references to the calling and the great work. There were mentions of specific dates, always coinciding with celestial events. Names, not family names. Titles. The weaver, the architect, the mouth. The language grew more vivid, more disturbing. One particular passage made the hair on my arms prickle. It was a description, almost a lament, written in a different hand. This one more precise, almost calligraphic, yet no less unsettling. And in that desolate place, where the gray walls weep and the cold wind whispers through the bars of despair, I saw them. Not men, not beasts, but shadows given form by the very air, moving with an unnatural grace. The thick fog clung to the ground like a shroud, obscuring all but their lowest limbs. Yet I knew their height, their terrible reach. They gathered in the prison yard in thick fog, their voices a low, guttural murmur that stole the heat from my blood, promising a release that was no release at all. Why would someone describe such a scene with such agonizing detail and in such a collection? It didn't fit with anything else I'd ever encountered in my years of archival work. My fingers, now almost numb, turned another page. Beneath it, a single word, scrawled repeatedly until the paper thinned. Awaken. Awaken. This wasn't merely a record of forgotten beliefs. It felt like a door, slowly creaking open. I was a meticulous man, a creature of order and logic, and these documents defied all sense. My heart, usually a steady metronome, began to beat with an irregular rhythm, a nervous flutter against my ribs. I spent the rest of the afternoon poring over the rest of the bundle, my planned logging tasks utterly abandoned. Sacrifice. The word wasn't explicitly written. It hung heavy in the air, implied by the context of offerings and the thinning veil. As twilight seeped through the tall, arched windows, painting the dust motes in the air with a faint, bruised purple, I realized I hadn't moved from my seat for hours. The stack of papers, now spread across my desk, seemed to hum with a low, almost inaudible vibration. My hands trembled slightly as I gathered them, placing them carefully back into their makeshift folder. And I, Arthur, the meticulous archivist, had just disturbed its slumber. My hands trembled slightly as I finally lifted the top sheet, the parchment dry and brittle beneath my fingertips. It wasn't the cold of the drafty archive that made me shiver, but something far less tangible. A prickle, like static electricity, traced its way up my arms. I told myself it was just the late hour, the chill of the old building, the fatigue of having spent too long hunched over decaying paper. It was easy to rationalize away the subtle unease that had begun to coil in my gut. The gaslight, perched on the corner of my desk, flickered, its flame momentarily dimming before flaring back to life. Old wiring, I muttered aloud, the sound swallowed by the cavernous room. This building, a relic itself, was perpetually on the verge of needing a complete overhaul. The electrical system was certainly no exception. I paused, tilting my head, straining to distinguish it from the groan of the building settling, or the wind whistling through the ill-fitting windows. Nothing. Imagination, I chastised myself, my voice barely audible. Too many hours spent alone in this quiet place, surrounded by the echoes of the past, was bound to play tricks on a person. My own thoughts, perhaps, just echoing back at me. The next morning, the unease persisted, though I fought against acknowledging it. I'd placed a particular ledger, bound in worn leather, on the top of a stack last night, ready for immediate review. Now it was gone. I spent a good 20 minutes retracing my steps, checking under other piles, peering into empty boxes. It wasn't until I finally gave up and went to retrieve a different document from a lower shelf that I found it, tucked away, almost hidden, beneath a stack of unrelated property deeds from the 1920s. I scoffed, a dry sound in the quiet. Absent-minded, Arthur. Truly absent-minded, I lectured myself, shaking my head. My meticulous system, usually infallible, must have been disrupted by my own exhaustion. That had to be it. I was just tired. Determined to dismiss these small, irritating anomalies, I plunged back into the correspondences. These weren't just scattered notes. They were fragments of a larger, terrifying tapestry. There was a recurring symbol, a jagged, incomplete circle with 3 radiating lines, often etched crudely at the bottom of a letter or on the back of a receipt for some obscure herb. Then there were the dates. Specific dates, aligned with lunar cycles, reappeared in different hands, different towns, spanning a decade. Each date was invariably followed by a report of a local disappearance, usually an outcast, a wanderer, someone with no family to ask questions. Stark and unsettling. The prison yard. I knew the place, or what was left of it. A crumbling stone wall, long since abandoned, now just a forlorn landmark on the edge of town, perpetually shrouded in a damp, heavy mist that clung to the low-lying ground. I cross-referenced the names. They weren't prominent citizens, no grand landowners or merchants. They were often marginalized figures, a transient laborer, a woman ostracized for her unconventional beliefs, a young man who had simply vanished from the local tavern one night. The correspondences, pieced together, suggested a network, a quiet, insidious thread woven through the fabric of the community, overseen by a central, unnamed figure, referred to only as the Weaver. As I read deeper, a particularly disturbing passage from a tattered diary fragment caught my eye. The cult wasn't just observing or worshiping, they were actively doing something. The disappearances weren't just unfortunate incidents, they were sacrifices. I tried to tell myself it was just the old building, the failing infrastructure, my own tired mind. But the evidence, laid out before me in crumbling ink and fading script, told a different story. The patterns were too precise, the illusions too specific, and suddenly, the thought of being alone in this vast, ancient building didn't feel quite so harmless anymore. The words preparation of the vessel and absolute silence in the offering had etched themselves into my mind, a cold, sharp script. I'd tried to dismiss them, to file them away as just another macabre detail in a collection overflowing with the strange and forgotten. After all, I was an archivist. My job was to observe, to categorize, to understand from a safe academic distance. But the passage had clung to me, a burr beneath my skin, a persistent whisper that followed me from the musty quiet of the archive into the unsettling silence of my own home. In the periphery of my vision, a flicker, a movement that vanished the moment I turned my head directly. A coat hanging on a hook in the hall would morph into a hunched figure for a fraction of a second. The old house, usually a comforting cocoon of predictable creaks and groans, now felt expansive, its corners holding secrets I hadn't noticed before. I told myself it was fatigue, the strain of deciphering faded ink and archaic script. My eyes were playing tricks on me. That was all. The next morning I found it. I'd left my mug on the small table beside my reading chair, a habit I usually broke for the sake of tidiness. But there, resting on the coaster next to it, was a small, crudely carved bird. Not a bird I recognized from any local species. Its wings were pulled back against its body, smooth and featureless, almost like a blunted arrowhead. Its head was small, beakless, with two tiny, vacant indentations where eyes should have been. My breath caught. I didn't own anything like this. I certainly hadn't placed it there. The bird looked disturbingly similar to the descriptions of effigies mentioned in one of the cult's later, more desperate journals. Small tokens left as offerings, or perhaps warnings. I turned the little carving over and over in my hand, my mind racing. Had I somehow brought it home with the documents? No, I was meticulous. Every document was logged, every object from the archive accounted for. This bird was alien to my possessions. Its presence was an intrusion, a deliberate placement. That night, sleep offered no escape. My dreams were not my own. Above me, a sky the color of bruised plums. Around me, an impenetrable shroud of thick fog, so dense I could barely see my own outstretched hand. The air tasted of damp earth and something acrid, metallic, like old pennies. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, heavy and unresponsive. Through the swirling mist, shapes began to coalesce. Tall, gaunt figures, their faces obscured by the swirling vapor, moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. It wasn't a language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. Worship, reverence, and a terrible, hungry anticipation. The fog thinned for a moment, and I saw them gathered around a central point, though what that point was I couldn't discern. I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs, the metallic taste of fear still coating my tongue. I swung my legs out of bed, the floorboards cool beneath my bare feet. I felt watched. Not just a vague sense of unease, but a distinct, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if eyes were boring into me from the corners of the room. I walked to the window, pulling back the curtain a fraction. Nothing moved. I checked the locks on the front door, then the back. They were all secure, just as I'd left them. Yet, the sense of intrusion, of a barrier having been breached, remained. Its vacant eyes seemed to follow me. I picked it up again, the wood still unnervingly cool. I hadn't put it back on the coaster. I'd left it on the kitchen table after examining it, intending to throw it out. But here it was, back on the counter, facing me. The methodical order of my life, the neat boundaries I'd erected between the past and the present, between the academic and the real, were crumbling. The cult wasn't just a subject of study anymore. It was here, in my home, in my dreams, blurring the lines of what I thought I knew. After all, I was an archivist. My job was to preserve, not to believe. But the chill that had settled deep in my bones persisted, gnawing at me, refusing to be cataloged and shelved. Sleep had offered no respite. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to talk to someone, to lay out the evidence, to hear a rational voice dismantle my growing unease. The next morning, I approached the senior archivist, a stoic man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of decades spent sifting through the detritus of history. He was sorting through a new acquisition of maritime charts, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Excuse me," I began, my voice tighter than I intended. He looked up, his spectacles glinting. "I've been working through the Blackwood collection. There's something unusual." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk, a gesture of polite but detached attention. "Unusual, Arthur? The Blackwood correspondence is certainly colorful. A family prone to dramatic flair, if I recall." I swallowed, the dryness in my throat making my voice crack slightly. "It's more than flair. I've cross-referenced several letters, diary entries, even a few ledgers. There's a recurring motif, a symbol, and mentions of rituals, specific dates." He picked up a page, his thumb tracing the jagged lines of the symbol. A folk cult, perhaps? Many such fringe groups sprung up in the 19th century. Superstitious nonsense, mostly. His tone was calm, dismissive, like he was explaining a simple filing error. "But the pattern," I insisted, leaning forward. "The way they connect, the dates, and the specific wording. It feels too cohesive for mere coincidence or isolated eccentricities." He set the papers down, pushing them gently back towards me. "Arthur, you're a diligent researcher, perhaps too diligent. It's easy to see patterns when you're looking for them, especially in such a vast, disordered collection. The human mind is wired for connection, even where none exists." He adjusted his spectacles, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You've been spending too much time in the stacks, my friend. These old documents, they get into your head. It's the occupational hazard of our profession." He paused, then continued, his voice softening, but with a paternalistic edge that stung. "Perhaps you should take a day or two away from the Blackwood material. Clear your head. You're connecting dots that were never meant to be connected, imagining a grand conspiracy out of isolated macabre curiosities. It's a common trap for the overzealous archivist." His words hit me like a physical blow. He didn't believe me. My careful arrangement of evidence, meant to shock and convince, had only served to brand me as unhinged. I gathered my papers, the flimsy sheets suddenly feeling heavy and incriminating. "Right," I mumbled. Of course, he was right, wasn't he? I had been spending too much time with these documents. The thought was almost as terrifying as the cult itself. That evening, the question of my sanity gnawed at me with renewed vigor. My path, almost without conscious thought, led me past the old municipal prison. Tonight, however, as I approached, a thick, milky fog had rolled in, clinging to the bricks, muffling all sound. I found myself pausing, drawn by an unsettling stillness. It swallowed the distant streetlights, turning them into blurred, jaundiced halos. Then I heard it. It wasn't loud, barely audible above the ringing in my own ears, but it vibrated through the soles of my shoes, a deep, resonant thrum that felt ancient and wrong. It seemed to emanate directly from the center of that fog-choked yard. Nothing. Just the shifting grayness. But then, a flicker. A movement, deep within the heart of the fog, too indistinct to be human, too fluid to be a trick of the light. My breath hitched. My hands, without conscious instruction, gripped the cold metal fence so tightly my knuckles ached. The senior archivist's words about imagination and overzealousness screamed in my mind, but they were drowned out by the thrumming in my chest, a frantic counterpoint to the hum I'd just heard. Was it just the wind? A distant engine? Or was it something else? Something responding to the very words I had dismissed. Something stirring in the mist-shrouded quiet. Back in the perceived safety of my apartment, I pored over my notes again, frantically rereading the phrases about the offering and the vessel. My hands trembled, but the fear was no longer abstract. The senior archivist was wrong. I wasn't just connecting dots. The dots were connecting themselves, and they were pulling me into something I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. The senior archivist's words had been a cold shower, a rational dousing of the strange fires that had been burning in my mind. Too much time with these documents. The phrase echoed, a polite dismissal wrapped in concern. He was right, wasn't he? Perhaps I had conjured this phantom terror, a delusion born from dust and forgotten ink. But then, a stubborn knot tightened in my gut. No, he hadn't seen what I'd seen. If no one else would look, then I would. My determination, a quiet, simmering thing, hardened into resolve. I returned to my small, cluttered study in the Historical Society's archives, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and the faint metallic tang of old iron from the shelves. I pulled the boxes of cult documents back onto my desk, their weight familiar, almost comforting in its density. I ignored the notes I'd already made, the connections I'd already drawn. Instead, I went back to the very beginning, to the earliest fragments, hoping a fresh pair of eyes, or perhaps a pair of eyes less clouded by recent events, would find something new. Hours blurred. My eyes ached, tracing lines of script that sometimes felt more like scratches on a tombstone than actual writing. Then, buried deep within a seemingly innocuous ledger detailing grain shipments from the late 1800s, a page I'd skimmed a dozen times, I found it. Not a cipher of letters, not a coded message, but a symbol. It was crudely drawn, almost childlike, tucked into the margin next to an entry about a particularly poor harvest. A circle, bisected by a jagged line, with 3 smaller, uneven dots arranged in a triangle just outside its perimeter. It looked like nothing, yet it thrummed with an inexplicable familiarity. I'd seen it before, or something like it, in the more esoteric ritualistic documents. My fingers brushed over the page, feeling the slight indentations. I held it closer to the gaslight, my breath catching. These weren't random. They formed a constellation, or perhaps a rudimentary map. I pulled out a larger, more detailed map of the county from the same period, its linen surface brittle with age. The meticulous scholarly part of me wanted to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a coincidence, a child's doodle with a faint, unrelated stain. But the other part, the part that had been slowly steeped in the unsettling reality of these documents, knew better. This was deliberate. This was a beckoning. The next morning, the air was a clammy shroud. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, swallowing the familiar landscape whole. But the symbol, the pinpricks, the drained fen etched themselves into my thoughts. It was a compulsion, a magnetic pull I couldn't articulate, but felt deep in my bones. It was as if the ancient entity, stirred by my probing, was actively reaching out, guiding my steps. The road grew narrower, rougher, eventually devolving into a muddy track that wound through skeletal trees. My vision was reduced to mere yards, the world beyond an indistinct blur. Beyond it, A crumbling stone wall stretched into the swirling mist, partially overgrown with ivy. An old, weather-beaten sign, barely legible, still hung askew. County Correctional Facility, closed 1903. I had found it. The sheer desolation of the place was profound. It was a tremor of recognition, a premonition. The map had led me here, to this place of forgotten confinement and decay. This wasn't merely a discovery, it was an arrival. I was no longer an observer, a meticulous archivist. I was an invited guest, standing at the threshold of something unspeakable, drawn by a force I was only just beginning to comprehend. The fog swirled, thick and opaque, obscuring everything beyond a few feet, making the world feel impossibly small, yet infinitely vast and terrifying in its hidden depths. The perimeter wall, crumbling and skeletal, vanished into the gray shroud barely 20 feet away, its barbed wire crown long since rusted to brittle threads. There was a gate, or what remained of one. 2 rusted posts leaning inwards like defeated sentinels, the heavy chain long gone. Beyond it, the mist seemed to deepen, swallowing even the faintest suggestion of a path. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to retreat to the familiar, if unsettling, confines of my archive. It was a morbid curiosity, yes, but also a desperate need to understand, to quantify the encroaching horror before it consumed me entirely. Inside, nestled amongst my notebooks and a flask of lukewarm tea, was a crude, hand-drawn map I'd painstakingly reconstructed from fragmented references in the cult's texts. It pointed, with unnerving precision, to a forgotten manor house, deep in the desolate marshlands bordering the old town. I stepped through the derelict gate. The crunch underfoot changed, becoming softer, muddier, as if the ground itself resisted my intrusion. I squinted, trying to discern the faint indentation of what might once have been a track. It wound between skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the mist like drowned hands. Each step was a deliberate act of will, my heart a dull thud against my ribs. I felt profoundly alone, utterly exposed, as if the fog itself were a living, watchful entity. Then, a vague, hulking mass began to coalesce in the gray ahead. The manor. It loomed, a monstrous, half-eaten silhouette, its grandeur long devoured by time and neglect. The garden that once surrounded it was a wilderness of thorny bushes and skeletal rose trellises, their dead tendrils reaching out like skeletal fingers. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but the archivist in me, the part that craved answers and order, pushed me forward. Dust motes danced in the sparse, diffused light filtering through grimy windows. The air was heavy, stagnant, thick with the smell of mildew and the faint, sweet decay of generations of forgotten belongings. I moved from room to room, my small flashlight beam cutting a tentative path through the gloom. Empty spaces, broken furniture draped in white sheets that looked like ghostly inhabitants, peeling wallpaper depicting scenes of pastoral bliss that now seemed grotesque. To my right, a large, heavy door stood slightly ajar. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer caught my eye, a glint of something reflective. My heart hammered. I pushed the door open further, the old wood groaning in protest. This room was different. There were no sheets, no broken furniture. It was large, circular, and utterly bare save for a raised dais in the center. Each was crudely carved, depicting a hunched, faceless entity with elongated limbs, identical to the illustrations I'd seen in the cult's most disturbing texts. But it wasn't just their presence that froze me. And beside it, in the exact center of the circle, sat a shallow, unglazed clay bowl. Inside, a scattering of black ash still faintly smoking, like a recently extinguished ember. This wasn't history. This wasn't some long-dormant relic. This was fresh. The air in the room, already heavy, seemed to press in on me, suffocating. The coppery smell intensified, and I could almost taste it, metallic and rank on my tongue. The cult hadn't just existed. It still existed. And someone perhaps very recently, had been here, performing their unspeakable rituals. I was in their space, and they knew it. A chill, far deeper than the cold air, snaked its way into my very bones. Something acrid and old, like forgotten iron left to rust for a century. Each crunch of my shoes on the scattered shards of broken concrete and brittle weeds felt unnaturally loud, a violation of the profound, unnerving silence. This place wasn't just forgotten. It felt actively, deliberately erased, scrubbed from common memory by the sheer weight of its isolation. My breath plumed out, a fleeting ghost in the swirling mist. The gate itself was now a blurry, indistinct shape behind me, a vague suggestion of an exit that felt increasingly theoretical. I moved forward, one cautious step at a time, my eyes straining. The ground underfoot shifted from cracked concrete to packed dirt, then to a rough, uneven flagstone path, barely visible beneath the encroaching weeds. This path, I suspected, led deeper into the central yard, towards whatever remnants might linger of the prison's core. The air grew heavier, the acrid smell intensifying, now mixed with a faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers or overripe fruit. It was a smell that didn't belong in a place of stone and iron. Then, through a sudden brief thinning of the fog, I saw it. A low, circular wall of rough-hewn stones, perhaps waist-high, forming an enclosure in the middle of the yard. It was too regular, too deliberate for a simple ruin. The stones of the wall were slick with moisture, covered in a fine layer of green moss and black lichen. But it wasn't just the age that caught my attention. Etched into the inner surface of the stones, faint but unmistakable, were a series of symbols. Not the elegant, precise glyphs of ancient languages, but crude, almost violent markings. Jagged lines, open circles, inverted triangles, all connected by an intricate web of scratches that looked like veins or roots. They pulsed with an unsettling familiarity, echoing the strange diagrams I'd found in the cult's texts. The air inside the circle felt different, heavier, charged. The cloying sweetness was stronger here, almost suffocating. And then, beneath my fingertips, I felt it. A faint vibration, a low resonant thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. It was barely perceptible, a frequency more felt than heard, like a distant, massive engine idling beneath the ground. I spun around, my heart giving a violent lurch against my ribs, but the fog was a solid wall. Nothing. I turned back to the circle, my gaze drawn to the center. There, on a raised, flat stone, was a depression, a shallow basin. It wasn't water. It was too thick, too deep in obsidian black, and it emitted that same cloying, sickly sweet odor. As I watched, a tiny ripple spread across its surface. Though there was no breeze, no apparent disturbance. The fog around me began to swirl, not gently, but with a deliberate, almost sentient motion, forming indistinct shapes at the periphery of my vision. Then, a sound. It was a chorus of voices, deep and resonant, utterly inhuman, speaking the same grating, sibilant sounds I'd heard before. The surface stretched, forming a shallow vortex, and from its depths, something began to rise. Not a form, not a creature, but a presence. It was vast, this presence, impossibly so. It wasn't something that could be seen with human eyes, but felt, perceived as a crushing weight on my mind, a profound wrongness that defied all natural law. This was it. This was the entity they served, the unspeakable thing whose name they dared not utter, whose existence twisted the very fabric of reality. Their heads were bowed towards the churning basin, their forms wavering like heat haze. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They were echoes, imprints of a terrible moment, made manifest by the ritual's lingering power, or perhaps by the entity's presence itself. And as it did, the fog around me thickened further, compressing, becoming a solid, impenetrable wall. The way back, the rusted gate, was gone. The prison yard was a cage, and I was caught inside, with the echoes of a monstrous past and a present, unspeakable horror that had just begun to stir. My sanity, my grasp on what was real, was fraying, unraveling like old cloth in the face of something so utterly ancient and profoundly evil. The smell intensified, a coppery, almost sweet undertone now, sharp and undeniable. It pricked at the back of my throat, making my stomach churn. Something acrid and old, like forgotten iron left to bleed. My breath plumed out, a ragged ghost in the dense air. There was no sound beyond the faint drip of moisture from unseen eaves, no echo of the city, only this profound, suffocating silence. Not a solid form at first, but a deeper gray against the lighter gray, coalescing, thickening. Another followed, and another, until 5 distinct figures stood perhaps 10 feet from me, their forms indistinct, like statues carved from the fog itself. Their faces, if they had any discernible features, were lost in the swirling mist. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to vibrate in my bones, bypassing my ears. You found your way, Arthur, as predicted. My heart jumped, a frantic hummingbird trapped in my chest. They knew my name. Of course, they knew. I had dug into their past, stirred their dormant malice, to bring forth that which yearns. My mind raced, scrambling through the fragmented notes and cryptic symbols I'd painstakingly deciphered. The threshold, the conduit, the consummation. It all pointed to this place, this forgotten prison yard, as more than just a site of historical suffering. I could just make out the slope of a hood, the suggestion of a hand-raising. The veil thins, archivist. The ancient covenant approaches its final term. This place, consecrated by generations of despair and confinement, is the perfect key. The ancient letters, the ones that spoke of feeding the hunger, of drawing essence from the bound. It wasn't just a metaphor for suffering, it was literal. The prison, its very purpose to contain and inflict, had been a slow-burning furnace, collecting something intangible but potent. And you want to open it? My voice trembled, the full, horrifying implication dawning on me. They weren't trying to stop anything. They were trying to facilitate it. We merely assist the inevitable, the leader said, and now I could almost feel his gaze, a weight pressing down on me through the fog. The patterns are clear, the cycles unbroken. The world is ripe for its true inheritors. And you, Arthur, by your tireless pursuit of our history, have become the final thread. A rich harvest, carefully cultivated. And now, with the proper catalyst, the gateway can be fully opened. The entity you so diligently researched, Arthur, waits. The entity. The nameless, formless thing hinted at in the most corrupted of the correspondences, described only by its insatiable need. It wasn't a metaphor. It was real. The metallic smell in the air, the acrid tang. It wasn't just old iron. It was old blood. The leader raised a hand, and from the fog, 2 more figures emerged, moving with unnerving swiftness. Panic surged, a hot, desperate wave. I struggled, twisting, kicking out, but my efforts were pathetic against their strength. You have unearthed the path. Now you will illuminate it. Your essence, steeped in the knowledge of our ancient purpose, will be the final key. The ultimate sacrifice. The conduit. My vision swam, the fog pressing in tighter, threatening to suffocate me. I was the key. My research, my meticulous, obsessive dive into their history, hadn't just revealed their goals. It had made me a part of them. I was the offering. And I, Arthur, the quiet archivist, was about to be broken open, not to release myself, but to release something else entirely. My vision swam, the fog pressing in tighter, threatening to suffocate me. I was the key. I was no longer an observer. I was the offering. They were pulling me, dragging me across the uneven, muddy ground. My clothes, already soaked through, snagged on loose stones, tearing with a soft rip. Pain flared in my shoulder, a searing agony that sliced through the numb terror gripping me. I thrashed, a desperate animalistic struggle against the inevitable. My fingers, numb and clumsy, scrabbled for purchase, digging into the slick earth. I saw faces, or thought I did. Indistinct blurs with eyes that seemed to glow with a feverish light, their mouths open in that droning chant. A jolt, a sudden, violent shove, and I was falling. Not a long drop, but enough to dislodge me from their grasp. I landed hard, my chin striking something sharp. The coppery taste of blood flooded my mouth, mingling with the metallic tang already lingering in the air. I lay there, momentarily stunned, the chanting a dull throb behind my eyes. This was it, I thought. This was the end. But then, a primal urge, a flicker of defiance ignited within me. I was not ready. Not yet. I pushed myself up, scrambling on hands and knees, ignoring the protesting screams of my muscles. The fog was a blessing and a curse. It hid me, but it also hid them. I crawled blindly away from the direction I'd been dragged. I pressed myself against it, gasping, my breath ragged and loud in my own ears. The chanting seemed to ebb, or perhaps I was just moving beyond its immediate reach. I kept going, one foot after the other, stumbling, half running, half crawling, until the rough stone gave way to something softer, more uneven. Weeds, perhaps. I had no idea where I was going, only that it had to be away. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the fear was a relentless engine driving me forward. I didn't stop until the fog began to thin, giving way to the sickly gray of pre-dawn light, and the sounds of the city, distant but real, reached my ears. I emerged from the tree line bordering the old grounds, a ghost. My skin was a mosaic of scrapes and bruises. A deep gash bled sluggishly on my forehead, and my left shoulder screamed with every movement. But it was the inside that felt truly ravaged. I stumbled onto a deserted street, the first hints of morning traffic still hours away. The world felt wrong, too bright, too quiet, too normal after what I had endured. But it wasn't just the cuts and grime. There was something else, a faint, almost invisible mark, like a brand, on the side of my neck, just beneath my ear. It was one of their sigils, burned into my flesh, a permanent testament to my unwilling participation. I made it back to my small apartment, the journey a blur of pain and disorientation. The landlady, a stoic woman who usually only grunted in my direction, took one look at me and recoiled, her eyes wide with something akin to fear. Words spilled out, disjointed and frantic, about ancient symbols and the terrible things they wanted to do. She just shook her head, her face a mask of pity and alarm, then quickly retreated, locking her door. I called the local authorities. A patrol officer arrived, a young man with a tired face and a skeptical gaze. I sat him down, forced myself to speak calmly, rationally, about the historical society, the unearthed documents, the discovery of the cult's existence, and then the night itself. I described the chanting, the fog, the feeling of being dragged, the sigil on my neck. He listened, his pen hovering over his notepad, but his eyes kept flicking to my disheveled appearance, the dried blood, the frantic energy I couldn't quite suppress. "Mr. Arthur," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you've clearly been through a traumatic experience. Perhaps a fall, a mugging. It happens in that area." He motioned vaguely. "But a cult? Rituals? You're saying this happened in the old prison yard?" I nodded vehemently, pointing to my neck. "Look, this is proof. It's a sigil from their texts." He leaned closer, squinting at the mark. "Looks like a bad rash, sir. Or maybe you scratched yourself. You should get that looked at. He advised me to get some rest, to see a proper medical professional, and then he left, promising to keep an eye out, but offering nothing more. His departure was less a dismissal and more a quiet, professional way of saying he thought I was unhinged. I was alone, truly alone. The horror hadn't ended in the prison yard. It had followed me. It had marked me. And now, it had isolated me. My escape wasn't freedom. It was merely a change of venue for the ongoing nightmare. I was still part of their work, and the truth was far, far worse. I woke up, or at least I thought I did, to a cold that sank into my bones like damp earth. My eyes, refusing to open fully, registered a diffuse gray light, thick and unyielding. It wasn't the familiar dimness of my apartment, nor the dusty haze of the archives. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, my head a dull throb, and found myself standing in a vast, desolate expanse. The ground beneath my worn shoes was rough, compacted gravel, damp and gritty. The air tasted of metal and something acrid, like burnt leaves mixed with old rain. I could feel the clammy kiss of the fog against my exposed skin, chilling me instantly. I strained my ears, listening for a sound, any sound, that could anchor me. Nothing. How had I gotten here? The detective, his face a mask of polite skepticism, had just left my apartment, dismissing the strange mark on my arm as nothing more than a rash. "You should get that looked at," he'd said, his voice as flat as a forgotten ledger. I remembered the dull ache in my arm, the strange pattern that seemed to shimmer just beneath the skin. But now, here, in this suffocating gray, the mark felt less like a physical ailment and more like a brand, a claim. I stumbled forward, my arms outstretched, trying to pierce the veil. Each step was an act of faith, a blind lurch into the unknown. I felt utterly alone, abandoned to this spectral landscape. My attempts to explain, to present the evidence I'd meticulously gathered from the archives, had been met with polite dismissal, a patronizing pat on the head. He'd seen a reclusive archivist, a man perhaps a little too invested in his dusty past. I had tried to expose it, to pull the threads of this ancient evil into the light, but the light itself seemed to recoil. A low, guttural sound tore through the fog, close enough to make me freeze. It wasn't human, not quite. More like the rasp of stone on stone, or a beast trying to clear its throat of gravel. My breath hitched. I spun around, eyes wide, trying to pinpoint the source, but the fog was an impenetrable shroud. Then, a flicker. A brief, almost imperceptible shift in the gray. A shape, vaguely humanoid, seemed to coalesce at the very edge of my vision, just beyond the reach of the fog's thickest embrace. It was indistinct, like a memory half-formed, or a shadow cast by no light. It was watching me, waiting. And then the true horror of my situation, the insidious reveal, struck me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just that my efforts were futile because people wouldn't listen. It was that the entity wasn't just manifesting in the world. It was actively weaving itself into the fabric of reality, subtly altering perceptions, twisting the truth. The detective hadn't simply dismissed me. He had been subtly influenced, his mind nudged away from the truth. The mark on my arm wasn't just a rash. It was a physical manifestation of its reach, a claim on my own flesh, a sign that the boundaries between my body and its influence were blurring. My archival research, the very foundation of my understanding, began to feel like a trap. Had the entity allowed me to discover these documents only to lead me down a dead end, to make me seem mad? Was it feeding me information, twisting the past to serve its present agenda? I remembered a recent email from a colleague at the Historical Society, a seemingly innocuous request for a specific set of records. And the colleague's tone in the email, usually brisk and professional, had carried a strange undercurrent of anticipation. The corruption wasn't just out there, in forgotten rituals and ancient texts. It was here, now, in the mundane interactions of my daily life, infecting the very people around me. My colleagues, the society's director, even the quiet old woman who cleaned the archives. Could they too be subtly swayed, their wills bent, their perceptions clouded? The idea was a sickening revelation. If those closest to me, those I implicitly trusted, were compromised, then who was left? Who could I turn to? It was a silent, unblinking judgment, a promise of absolute dominion. My stomach churned with a primal fear. Every attempt to fight it conventionally, to expose it through reason and evidence, was a dead end. The entity was not a criminal to be caught, nor a secret to be revealed in a newspaper. It was a force that warped reality itself, making its own existence undeniable while simultaneously making it impossible to prove. If the ordinary avenues were closed, if the world itself was being subtly reshaped, then perhaps an extraordinary, irreversible act was the only way. A final, drastic measure that would, at the very least, disrupt its insidious work, even if it meant sacrificing everything I had, everything I was. I knew it might be in vain, a futile gesture against an unstoppable tide. But the alternative, to simply surrender, to watch as the world was slowly consumed, was utterly unthinkable. This was something else entirely. A metallic tang, like rust, and something else vaguely organic filled my nostrils. Beneath my cheek, the ground was rough, uneven concrete, pebbled with sharp fragments that pressed into my skin. Finally, with a grunt that felt like tearing canvas, I forced my eyelids apart. The world was a swirling canvas of gray, a dense, suffocating blanket that swallowed all depth and detail. The air hung heavy and still, trapping the bitter chill close to the ground. Slowly, painfully, I rose to my hands and knees, then pushed myself upright, swaying. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes. Then a sound. A low, rhythmic murmur like a hive of insects grew clearer, closer. It was a chant, deep and resonant, a cadence that felt ancient and wrong. My stomach clenched. I knew that sound. I had read about it, studied its archaic notation in those terrible, brittle documents. My mind, still struggling to fully engage, recoiled from the implication. Not a wall, but figures, many of them. As they drew nearer, the chanting swelled, a wave of guttural melodic sound that vibrated in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. They were here, and so was I. My legs, however, refused to move. It was as if the very air had become viscous, holding me in place. The figures parted, forming a semicircle around me. In the center of their formation, a low, squat stone altar, wet with condensation, emerged from the mist. On it, something gleamed dully. It was a metal disc, intricately etched with the same symbols I had seen in the cult's correspondences, symbols that had once been merely arcane curiosities. Now they pulsed with a faint inner light, a sickly green. One of the robed figures, taller than the rest, stepped forward. This individual held a heavy, leather-bound volume. One of the ledgers from the archives, I realized with a jolt of horror. My ledger. The one I had been studying, the one that had led me down this impossible path. The pages were open, and the individual's unseen gaze seemed fixed on them. The chanting intensified, a rising crescendo that clawed at the edges of my sanity. My head began to spin. The green light on the disc pulsed faster, mirroring the frantic beat of my own heart. This wasn't just a discovery anymore. This was my end. Or perhaps something worse than an end. The taller figure lifted the ledger, holding it aloft. Its voice, when it came, was not a chant, but a low, resonant rumble, a language I almost understood yet couldn't grasp. It spoke of cycles, of awakening, of a vessel. And then, It turned its attention to me. Even through the obscuring fog and the shadow of the cowl, I felt the piercing intensity of its focus. I was the last piece, the final resonance. My meticulous work, my academic curiosity, had not merely uncovered their history, it had completed their summoning. I had not been a chronicler, I had been a catalyst. As the cultist lowered the ledger, the green light from the disc on the altar flared, bathing the fog in an unearthly glow. I felt a pulling sensation, a strange, undeniable draw towards the altar, towards the pulsing disc. My feet began to move, unwillingly, slowly, dragging me forward. I stumbled towards the altar, my vision blurring, the chanting a deafening roar in my ears. The disc pulsed, a beacon of malevolent light. To merge, to become. My body convulsed, a silent scream trapped within me. The world spun, the fog, the figures, the altar, all melting into a single overwhelming sensation of invasion. The cult's work was not merely completed, it had found its new home. The world would never know what had truly happened here, in this forgotten prison yard, swallowed by the thick, unforgiving fog. The insidious evil, long dormant, had found its way back, and I, the meticulous archivist, had been its unwitting, unwilling gateway.